If you are a seller who does not live in the United States, or you're forming a company not in the US and you want to sell in the US, or if you just want to sell in different Amazon countries, maybe that's a different topic. I'm not even sure. I don't know how to navigate this. Whoever's watching this video doesn't know how to navigate it. How do they navigate it, Paul?
Right. Well, the issue of forming a new business in the United States, it's really not that complicated. And in some ways, it's actually easier for sellers in a foreign country to do business in the US than it is for US sellers. US sellers, one, have to pay US tax, whereas foreign sellers may not. We have this thing called tax treaties. So how you form is important, because if you form with the right entity and the right way, you can be considered not doing business in the US, not having what's called a permanent establishment. For any sales tax nerds out there, it's kind of like the international tax version of Nexus. You can be deemed not to have that, even though you are using fulfillment by Amazon and may be able to operate under the tax treaty. But there's some caveats to how you do that. But it's not that complicated. Forming an LLC is pretty similar to how you would do it from the US perspective. Now, you may actually be less concerned about your personal assets, because if you live in, Italy, I don't know how easy it's going to be for the United States, for a creditor from the US to come after you without the full faith and credit clause, which is something that US sellers have to deal with. It's a much harder process to go after foreign assets. And so, there is some sort of natural insulation, not to say it's impossible, but there's certainly some natural insulation from creditors when you're a foreign company. Now, that doesn't mean the assets that are in your company couldn't be at risk. So if you have money in the bank or inventory in an Amazon facility, it is somewhat advantageous almost to be a foreign seller versus a US seller. Now, when I say tax treaty, keep in mind the state governments don't necessarily respect this tax treaties. In fact, the Supreme Court has said that the tax treaties don't apply to the state. So you might find yourself in a situation where you're not paying US income tax, but you might have to prepare an income tax return for the US, and you have to do that anyway, but then you actually have to file it with the states, sort of like an informational return, and then use that as the basis to pay certain state income tax if the states take the position. I actually don't believe you should be paying the states either. It's a long story, but if you ask a typical state government representative, they would probably say you do, and that's still an issue that's being fought right now. My point being is it isn't perfectly clean as an Amazon seller, but it is definitely, being a foreign-based seller it's a little bit nicer than being in a US-based seller position right now. What else can I tell you? Bank accounts. That is the one thing that I will not do. I've read that there are some folks out there who will help set up bank accounts. There's a lot of concerns about terrorism in the United States right now. And so sort of sight unseen, helping somebody, open up a bank account, maybe you make them an officer of your company. I've read these things, but as a law firm, we won't do it. So what I advise clients is, if you're coming to the US to do business, maybe pick an awesome, Amazon event and then open up a bank account in person. It's very easy. Once you have your LLC formed, your tax ID, you can go to Bank of America with your passport and open up a bank account very easily. It's just not something you can do remotely very easily.
So there's different services like FX and TransferWise, and I've talked with them. Is that kind of a workaround that you could use, where you essentially get a account that can accept US dollars?
Right. And that's fine. They're not FDIC insured banks, right? I know one company that has a deal with a major bank, and those bank accounts aren't titled in your name. They're titled in their name.
Yep.
So you risk, because you have no FDIC insurance and you actually are running on the credit and stability of the company who's offering the service. So if they fall apart, right? I mean, it's a very unregulated area right now. I'm not saying not to do it. Just know that, some people use them for like short-term transfer solutions, like sort of as a conduit. But for the ones where they offer, like basically a mirror of a bank account, some even have an ATM card that they'll give you, just know the risks, that you're not getting the federal government insurance program and that you're really, subject to their stability. I am familiar with one of those services very well. And
right. So that was the high level overview. So very practical. They have a choice to make a company in the United States, or they have a choice to make a company not in the United States.
I would not be a company in the United States on Amazon. I don't believe Amazon requires you to have a U.S. tax ID to even be in the United States to sell into the Amazon U.S. System. But yeah, they have a choice to become a U.S. company, an LLC, a corporation. It does matter. It makes a difference what you pick. Usually, probably most foreign sellers I know use the single member LLC. We're going to be talking about this later. S corporation elections. You can't make an S corporation election when you're foreign, but then again, you shouldn't need to if you're doing it right and making sure you're not tripping a tax obligation in the U.S. And again, paying tax is not the same as filing tax. If you're a seller from another country doing business in the US, you still have to file things with the federal government. If you don't, you could be subject to certain fines. The government wants to know who's making money in the foreign countries. They want to know because they may want to challenge your status under the treaty, or just for, again, fraud and terrorism concerns are really big right now. And so you still have filing obligations, but you just may not have a tax payment obligation.
Okay. So if you're not in the US, you can sell.
You can sell.
Either make
Absolutely.
a US company, or you could make one in your own company, or you could just have the equivalent of a sole prop in your own country. Basically, is that what the other option was?
I think so. I don't know the answer to the question off the top of my head but my understanding is Amazon will let you sell into the US through your Amazon seller account. You can just like opening up an Amazon account. And so I don't see how they would stop you from doing it. There's certainly no legal reason why you couldn't sell into the US. You just might be subjecting yourself to personal tax. I mean, it probably wouldn't be the best idea, but it would probably, if I was doing business in the US, would have a US company or at least a foreign company doing business in the US. But again, it just depends on how you structure it. But it's certainly advantageous too. I mean, you might as well. It's a much easier time for a foreign seller to do business in the US than if a US seller wanting to do business in Canada. Unfortunately, the Canadian treaties aren't as friendly. Even though it's the same treaty, the way the Canadians interpret it versus the US, it's not as friendly. We're definitely a friendlier country, despite what some might say. We're nice people.
Great. So then do they need to register in the USA? So if they have a foreign company that they make, what do they have to do like to sell on Amazon in the US? Is there anything extra, or they'll just have to file taxes or something for what they do in the USA?
They're going to have to file a form. They're going to have to file certain treaty disclosure forms in the US. They can actually register their foreign company as sort of the US equivalent. So you could actually, if you have sort of like the Luxembourg equivalent of an LLC, you could register it in a state as an LLC, or you can form a new LLC, a single member LLC, which the government typically, when you're a single owner LLC, it's sort of technically call it tax nothing. That's the technical term for it. In other words, the IRS really isn't going to regard that as something separate and distinct from its owner. And so, setting up a simple single member LLC and operating out of that might be an easy way to go, but not necessary. There's an added cost to doing that, but in both scenarios, you could potentially be covered under the tax treaties and not have to pay the US income taxes because you're not doing business in the US in a certain way. You're not tripping sort of, again, the international equivalent of nexus, what we call permanent establishment under the tax treaty. Simply housing inventory is one exception to permanent establishment. That's in just about most countries' tax treaties. Now, I should caveat that too. There are some countries that don't have tax treaties with the US, and so the question's a little bit murkier there. So I should caveat that, but most of the sellers I deal with are from countries that have tax treaties with the US.
Okay. Well, this sounds like a pretty good overview of things to think about and potentially an area to speak to an expert. Because this one is I've been able to understand a lot of concepts myself. It's always been one that's pretty tricky personally.
Yeah, it's not complicated. Don't talk to a person who doesn't know international tax. I used to do these massive restructuring things for like Walmart and GE. I mean, this is like part of what I like about what I do is it's nice to help people, and the work is more appreciated. People really do appreciate the help, and it's nice to be able to sort of take a skill set that I've had for years and get to help people make sense of things. And this really isn't that complicated to somebody who's done this a million times. But if you're working with a tax person, an accountant, or lawyer who doesn't know international tax, you really need to run. You need somebody that does understand the treaties. Yeah, because it's crazy. But I mean, perfect example, if a client reached out to me, their prior tax advisor set them up as a C corporation or, traditional corporation, not an LLC, and filed tax returns and triggered these $25,000 strict liability penalties because they didn't know that they had to make certain disclosures. Not only did they not have to pay the tax that they paid, so they overpaid tax by 10 grand, they ended up getting a bill for 25 grand that they actually shouldn't have owed because if they'd made the right disclosures. But, again, the guy didn't know any better. So, you got to be a little bit careful with who you work with. But anybody that has a decent understanding of international tax should be able to help you through it. We're certainly happy to help you. Not to plug my own firm, but, we deal with it a lot.
You guys go to Paul, or if you go to someone else, just make sure that they know what they're talking about.
They know what they're talking about.
All right. Well, thank you. So if you guys have any other questions, let us know. And I hope that it was helpful.